Penguin Random House Audio presents This Kind of Trouble by Tochi Eze. Narrated by Yekinni.
The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. Ezekiel, chapter 18, verse 20. Families are everyone's first war. Tola Abraham Rotimi, We Need to Talk About Snails, 2017. Chapter 1. Benjamin. Atlanta, 2005. Benjamin sat across from the bank officer. There was a small square window inches below the ceiling so that the afternoon sun rays slanted through the opening and fell on his face. The room reminded him of his own office in Ikoyi. The humidity, the feeling of old leather against his back, the smell of tobacco that filtered in from the entrance, as though time had frozen into a capsule. It occurred to him, while the bank officer sifted through his files, that a man should be entitled to the troubles of his making. No more, no less. Yet it seemed his own troubles began with his father. The poor chap had been born into a quarrel that made him an orphan. And if not his father, then who? Perhaps it began with Benjamin himself, those 40 or so years ago, when he'd moved to Lagos, that city damp with heat, aflame with post-independence ambition, unconscious of its chaos. No. He shook off the thoughts before it could settle. There was something else. Someone else. The conclusion was both familiar and inevitable, for his troubles, indeed, began with Margaret. Of course, his nostalgia could have been the effect of the phone call from the night before. He'd woken up this morning and wondered if he dreamed it, if her voice, after these many years, could have stayed the same. He was not a sentimental man, even in the old days. He had not given himself to the usual productions of romance, flowers, walking a woman to the salon, complimenting her dress and shoes, her nails, those long cosmetic talons. It was not his style. He'd loved his women the way his father had told him to, like a bird. One had to hover and watch. Affection was a matter of practicality. The bank officer was 42 years old, named Mark Troshinsky, after his Russian grandfather. His patrilineal family had moved to the United States in 1952. They were veterans, having fought in the Vietnam War. They bled for this country, the bank officer said, his eyes falling briefly on the small American flag on his desk. Last year, the bank officer continued, he'd had a health scare. He did not say what it was, and Benjamin did not ask. After the scare, he was thinking about early retirement. He wanted to spend time on the important things, he said. Benjamin nodded to indicate that he was listening, but his mind was now fully turned to Margaret. You must know what you are getting into, Benjamin's father had told him. However, as Benjamin would learn, there comes a time when a father's advice is cast away and the heart devises its own reasons. And when that time came for Benjamin, he followed an old cliché and fell for the great love of his life. Now he shifted slightly on his seat, an attempt to pull himself back to the present, to the bank officer's words. If it was a different day, if his mind was not crowded by the events of yesterday, by that phone call, Benjamin would have said something to the banker about the illusion of retirement. He knew firsthand that the only true retirement was death, and that the absence of work did not mean the absence of anxieties, both old and new. The bank officer had been to Europe, Thailand, and more recently Brazil, an avid traveller, proud of his worldliness. He pulled out a picture from the wallet in his breast pocket and showed Benjamin. The banker standing with 2 tanned teenagers, his daughters, Benjamin presumed, all 3 of them draped with red and black shawls. Benjamin smiled at the picture and asked about a painting that hung across his desk, performing, in his own way, that polite American curiosity. When Benjamin had first moved to the United States, he thought it absurd that he could learn intimate details of people's lives so casually, in train and bus stations. He still found it affecting that Americans could be so open and friendly, yet stubbornly private, generous with their stories but highly suspicious of any interest in their affairs. He smiled at the banker, then decided to offer his own gesture of a life. He shared how he too had travelled quite a bit, that he was originally from England, where he had his early education, that he had lived in Nigeria and Ghana, then gone back to London before moving to the United States to attend graduate school. I've always wanted to go to Africa, the bank officer said. He opened his drawer to pull out stacks of paper, spreading 3 pages on the polished desk. Is that right? Benjamin replied. I myself am Nigerian. He added after a pause. I see, the bank officer said, eyeing Benjamin. There was silence. Papers shuffled. A nudge to Benjamin to sign documents. Then the bank officer warmed up again as he put the papers away. I suppose if we dig far enough, we'd all find a little of Africa in us, the officer said, smiling. Benjamin had come to enjoy watching the surprise, then confusion on people's faces whenever he said that he was Nigerian. His skin was the same pale pigment of most white men. His hazel eyes tinted toward green when he stood in the sun. It was a confusion that he, too, had carried as a boy. His father's skin had been light enough, and so Benjamin had never questioned how much paler his mother was when she stood next to his father, or the way his father's hair coiled around his head. Benjamin was 9 years old when he learned about the difference between his father and mother, and he'd only discovered it when one of the boys in his catechism class asked, How is it that your mother married a Negro? Benjamin had not said anything in response, but later that night, just before dinner, he'd stood beside his father, rolled up his dust-stained sleeves, then placed his hand against his old man's. It was the first time he saw the contrast, shocked that all this time he'd never noticed. You are dark, Benjamin said to his father. Not a question, a simple acknowledgement. It appears so, his father answered, then continued simply, Go clean up before your mother's cooking grows cold. Benjamin left the bank wishing he could have a cigarette, but he had not smoked in 12 years. He stood under the blue awning and watched a bird perch on a tree. His mind again returned to the events of yesterday, the call. It was a simple exchange, no longer than 5 seconds, maybe 6. But it was enough to send him back to Lagos, the city and the people he once called home. His father's connection to a small Nigerian village was almost mythical, a strange family story Benjamin often recounted to pretty women in his university days. But where his father's myth ended, his own life began. He'd had it all, a home, a wife, a child, his own child. Benjamin had 2 other marriages after that time in Nigeria, neither of which resulted in children. He had even, out of pity, entertained accusations of impotency by his second wife and their family clinician, a small weight to carry because Benjamin knew it to be undeniably false. He was capable of fatherhood, if only in a biological sense. It is true that he'd left Margaret, left his child, left the country, but leaving was not a crime. If there was one thing that he had learned as a man, it was this. All commitments are negotiable. With 2 legs and a good enough reason, one could always find the door. He told himself year after year that there'd been no other choice, that he'd had to remove himself from that specific situation as one might crawl out from under the weight of a stone pressing down on one's neck. Leaving was a game of survival, and he, Benjamin Fletcher, was good at surviving. He'd survived cancer at 47, a motorbike accident at 59, a heart attack at 61. Now, at 67, it seemed like the only demand life threw at him was to survive the consequences of the past. Chapter 2. The Kinsman. Umumilo, 1905. The virgins of Umumilo were pregnant, and no one knew who was responsible. It began when Okolo's bride, Adora, showed up at her husband's bedchamber on the night they were wed. After the traditional wine-carrying ceremony, when the guests and dancers and masquerades had retired, and the village had fallen asleep to the rhythm of toads croaking at the swamp, Adora quietly followed the senior wife, who ushered her into Okolo's hut. The young virgin's palms were sweaty, and her husband paced about in his bedchamber, slightly inebriated, both their thoughts fastened to the night and its expectations. Having married 4 women and been with 3 others, Okolo had a keen eye for a young virgin's body, the way it felt under his weight, the glistening skin, softened with youth and shear oil. Despite his experience, Okolo was nervous. He would try to slow things down this time, he thought, not breathe too heavily, wipe the drool from his mouth. He would use his wrapper to hide the sight of his member, something he considered only after he...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?